Hello and welcome to Citizen Earned, where I share my experience of becoming an American and unpack what it means to be an American through that experience. Thus far, I have shared the three guiding documents that I use to evaluate what is American and what is not, and what I need to do to be the best citizen that I can be. And those three documents are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And I have shared the Oath of Allegiance, which I took along with a few other people that faithful day to become an American citizen. So, I've shared kind of everything that up until this point that brings me to the reason that this channel exists, which is as an immigrant, I took an oath of allegiance. In part, that oath of allegiance says that I need to protect the country, protect the country from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. It says many other things as well, but essentially, the point is that the new citizens, immigrants becoming citizens, need to be willing to uphold that which is American and fight that which is not American. Whether that's thoughts or ideas or physical actions or people or countries or financial forces, doesn't really matter. As an immigrant, I swore an oath to be allegiant to this country, so I have to figure out how to do that. In trying to figure out how to do that, my chosen framework is the Bill of Rights. Our founding fathers kind of enumerated our basic rights as human beings. The Bill of Rights isn't something that's given to you. Well, let's put it this way. A right is something that you have whether the government or any powerful body wants you to have that attribute or not. In this episode, we're going to talk about the First Amendment, the right to freedom of speech. We have that right of freedom of speech. We have that ability to speak, whether the government wants us to or not. Rights are different from privileges, in that privileges are given to us by that governing body, i.e., the government. For instance, a driver's license. You don't need a driver's license to drive a car. You need a driver's license to drive a car on public roads. Why? Because those public roads are owned and maintained by the governing body. They are responsible for maintaining those roads. We use those roads, so we all have to have a common method of using those roads. And the driver's license is to ensure that we all understand and know that common method. Speech is very different. We can go and find the information, acquire the information, process the information, talk about the information, and do all of this stuff with information regardless of what the government thinks or wants us to do. So the Bill of Rights has been a good method or framework for me to figure out what I need to do as a citizen, having been an immigrant or being an immigrant, to deliver on my oath of allegiance to be the best American I can be. I hope all of that makes sense. Anyway, so within the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment is the freedom of speech, right? Let me just reiterate how it sounds exactly. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, so let me just recap here. Congress, the governing body, right, the House and the Senate combined, shall not make a law respecting an establishment of religion So, picking or holding one religion more important than another, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or keeping people from pursuing a particular religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, so of controlling the flow of information, or of the press, published information, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, or for people to peacefully gather and have their voices heard, and to petition the government for a redress of grievance. So if the people don't like what the government is doing, it's their right to tell them that they don't agree with them what they're doing. That came out a little clunky. Let's try again. People have the ability to speak. People have the ability to write. They can use these abilities whether the government wants them to or not. The government can try to stop them, but the First Amendment enumerates the fact that they have this ability and they can use this ability, and if the government tries to take this ability away, the government is stepping on those rights. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I hope that's crystal clear, because it's kind of important. The reason it is important or rather, the reason it is important to me and the reason I'm making a particular point about this is because I want to know why the First Amendment exists. Obviously, we have this ability, whether the government wants us to or not. But in writing it down in the Bill of Rights, what were the Founding Fathers trying to communicate? Now, obviously, we have the history saying that the king forced them to be a certain religion, force them to burn dangerous thoughts and ideas, censor thoughts, censor information, and make sure to keep control and power over them to stay in power. The monarchs of England at that time, right? That's one thing, but I think it hits on a more fundamental idea, and that fundamental idea is the flow of information. And that's why it's a right and not a privilege, because governments cannot stop the flow of information. They can try, and oftentimes they can succeed to some extent, but they will never completely stop the flow of information. Except when it's a totalitarian regime like maybe North Korea, right? But even then, people there know that there is a better world out there, that there is a world out there where people aren't starving. So they cannot completely stop the flow of information. The important piece, I think, of the First Amendment is not the flow of information and simply continuing the flow of information, but rather what we do with that information. Why do we have this ability, or what do we do with this information, and how do we process this information, right? So there are two ways that humans process information. One is emotionally, and two is through reason. Okay. Let's take a quick step back. Information flow. There are three characteristics and three ways that life has learned how to transfer information from generation to generation and species to species. The first one is instinct. This is something that's coded into our DNA, and we know how to do it and why to do it and all of this at like a base level, right? Usually things like eating, sleeping, and reproducing are instinctual things that we know, pieces of information that somehow our bodies just know how to do it. Fight or flight, self-preservation, these types of things. That's instinct. The second evolutionary step of information flow is in the form of emotion, and that comes into play with mammals, all mammals. It's how humans can communicate with dogs or dolphins, horses, and how we can train them. It's a very basic instruction set, if we were to think about this in like computer terms, of if-then statements. If you, dog, do this, I give you a treat. Dog says, oh, if I do this, I get a treat. And so we can train, but we can also find a bond there. And that emotion is very strong, and since it's just above instinct, we're just barely aware of it. And it can kind of sometimes seem like reason, because it does have a very rudimentary set of reason in there. I want this, I do this, I get what I want, right? And then the one thing that sets humans apart from other species on the planet is our ability to reason, or our ability to use logic. Let me rephrase that and say our ability for abstract thought, our ability to entertain something or to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, to infer the existence of something before we know that it exists. This is the entire idea and fundamental thought that science is built on. We look at something, and based off of that, we deduce that something else must exist. Then we come up with an experiment to verify or disprove that theory. So abstract thought is very important, and the first steps that were taken in structured abstract thought was the discipline of logic, which was laid down by the Greeks to more than 2,000 years ago. Pretty amazing discipline that they created. And it is, logic is the framework or the discipline of organizing our thoughts, right? And of using certain thoughts to either add validity or subtract validity to certain ideas and pieces of information. It is a good way to, for instance, evaluate facts and whether facts are true or false. It's a good way to evaluate whether ideas and arguments are cogent or not, whether they're useful or not, how they're being employed or not. It's a system of evaluating our thoughts for ourselves. So logic is really important, but keep in mind, we're a combination of all three pieces of information flow: instinct, emotion, and abstract thought. So now that we have the three types of information processing that humans do, instinct, emotion, and abstract thought, let's take a look at how we employ those on the different types of information we're exposed to in this day and age. So just as an example, we have facts, we have statistics, we have shared feelings. That's kind of like what an entire neighborhood or state, county, or region in our country, where the majority of people feel the same way. And then I also want to cover the difference between primary and secondary sources. All of this stuff is really important for what's coming down the line. So if there's a concept that doesn't quite make sense, please shout it out down below, and I will readdress it and try to find some clarity. Anyway, okay, so a fact is a known thing where everybody agrees on it. Sometimes facts are disproven and shown to be false. So facts are not necessarily always true. They can be false if enough people agree that they are true. That kind of sounds weird, and I don't have an example right now, but I can find you one. I'm sure many of you can comment on an example of a false fact. Statistics are important because we use statistics and or numbers to understand an idea or a concept or evaluate it. The danger with statistics is how we create that statistic. For instance, if you have an entire pie and there's, let's say, a tiny sliver of information here, and the point that you want to prove is right here, then statistically, all to make that tiny little sliver seem significant, all you need to do is find a category that that tiny sliver fits into. So instead of saying this tiny little sliver is part of the whole, you say this tiny little sliver is part of this chunk. What you don't say is that this chunk is a small chunk of the circle. So now all of a sudden this tiny little sliver of the whole seems like a much bigger piece of the smaller slice. And if we're not careful, we can be duped by those statistics. So we have to know the context. And that word is going to come up a lot. Shared feelings is a good and a bad thing. Usually there's some truth to shared feelings because feelings, are below abstract thought and above instinct, and they're kind of there to help us survive. They're part of the evolutionary chain. Like, there's probably a reason we all feel a certain way about something, and we should probably pay attention to that. Where that gets dangerous is letting those feelings influence our decision making. Because we'll get there. And then the other thing that I need to talk about is primary sources. So a primary source is a direct source of information. So let's say that there was an event. There was a tornado. And people want to know what it's like to be in a tornado. Let's say that there was a person that was in a tornado shelter and heard the tornado go by. And then there was that cool glider from not NOAA, maybe NOAA. Anyway, I think they have a glider that flies into the eye of hurricanes. That's not a tornado, though. This is a bad example. A primary source. Let's say somebody is in a car crash, and we want to know what it's like to be in a car crash. The person that was in the crash, that was in the car when it crashed, would be a primary source. They would be able to tell us, I was driving and then all of a sudden it was loud noises and sparks and powdery dust, and then I woke up and I saw that I had crashed. Primary source, yes. Good primary source? Not necessarily, because the human body cannot process the amount of information that happened in that car crash as fast as it happens. So that's why we have crash dummies, and why we do this with computers and simulate that crash. The computers, the sensors, the electronics, they can detect, or they can gather a lot more information a lot more quickly, and so we can get a much better or much more accurate picture. Now think about this. We have this technology. We can get a better idea of what it's like. But the same crash simulated in a laboratory somewhere is a model, and it's not a primary source on that crash, right? So we have the person's primary source account of what happened in the crash, and we have the model of what should have happened in the crash that was recreated in a laboratory. And between the two, the information that might confirm or disconfirm what we see in the laboratory, we have to infer, right? So this is why information is so tricky. And we'll see why this is important down the line. But you have your primary source, you have your model data, and in between, we have two vehicles. We have abstract thought, where we can infer similarities or differences, or we have emotions, where personal experience can help us infer between the primary source and the model of how it should be, right? And to try and make sense of that. The reason the founding fathers enumerated the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is not just so that they could pursue the religion of their choice and not have the government keep them from pursuing that, or limiting what they say on the street, or what they might print in paper, or so that they could gather and be angry at the government. I think the reason they enumerated the First Amendment was because they knew what they didn't know, and that they didn't know everything, and that as humanity became more intelligent and discovered more things, there was going to be more information that needs to be processed. And the fastest and best way to process that information is through the collective consciousness, is through we, the people. The Constitution starts with we, the people, right? So why not crowdsource information processing? What is the best way to run a democratic society? The people should probably figure that out, right? In order for the people to be able to figure that out, they need to have access to the information and be educated enough to be able to evaluate or process the information correctly, right? To the best of everybody's ability. Or rather, for the greatest good for everybody else. I guess if you're utilitarian. So having said that, I guess then, my first responsibility as a citizen is to find the information, figure out the biases of this information, who's presenting it, why are they presenting it, evaluate the sources, see if these facts are true facts or false facts, read up and research where this information is coming from, figure out if it's a primary source or a secondary source. I don't think I've talked about secondary sources. Secondary sources is where somebody else is telling somebody a story of what happened. So, in our example of the car crash, let's say somebody saw the car crash happen on the side of the street, and then they told somebody. Those two people would both be secondary sources because they did not experience the event. They're just retelling it or providing a recounting of the event, if that makes sense. So to come back to the citizen's responsibility, evaluate that information, evaluate whether it's a primary or a secondary source, and if that's a valid story. Then go see if there are any models that exist that represent this, and if there's any inferring or interpolation that needs to happen here to be able to understand it. And once the concept or the idea is fully understood, then use the tools which we have developed to make a decision for all of us for the betterment of this country. The tools that we have to evaluate that information is emotion and abstract thinking. And so the cycle starts over again. We have to keep evaluating things. I hope, sorry, this was a lot. There's a lot of abstract thoughts. I hope this helps. If not, please post some comments down below and let's see if I can't get this ironed out, because there's a lot going on up here and I don't always make sense. So please help me make sense. And thank you so much for watching, and I'm excited to see you the next time. Have a good day.